Welcome to this lecture on protecting freshwater habitats. The learning outcomes for this lecture are to understand the source pathway receptor concept, examine management measures for implementation in high status objective and priority area for action water bodies, and also to take a look at how do we determine the success of these implemented management measures in terms of protecting our water bodies. Let's start by introducing the source pathway receptor concept. This concept is used to describe the transport and attenuation of pollutants through our environment, and they allow us to identify areas referred to as critical source areas or CSAs. And these tend to be the locations within catchments where a high proportion of the total pollution originates. They occur when a significant amount of contaminant is available for mobilization, therefore becoming a source, and this typically coincides with the transport mechanism which acts as the pathway, and this then allows it to, get to a receiving water body, which becomes the receptor. Their identification is a key tool for environmental managers using the risk-based approach to decision making, and we see it implemented by the environmental protection agencies. The figure below gives the idea of the source pathway receptor concept from a farm perspective, and therefore illustrates potential sources, pathways and receptors that are typical within an agricultural environment. What's important here is to understand that it's not just at the surface levels that we see these source pathway receptor concepts, that we sometimes forget about the groundwater movement of water that can allow for pollutants to get to our receptor without there seemingly to being an obvious pathway or even sometimes source. Let's delve a little bit into the agricultural threats and pressures impacting on water quality. So when we take a little bit more of a deep dive into our sources or our pressures, they're the usual typical suspects of nutrients, sediment. There are other pollutants as well, such as herbicide and pesticides. We've got kind of new activities such as new maintained or cleared drains, which tend to be a little bit more physical. And then we also have things like flow, so the quantity of water that's on the move essentially. And then within the channel itself, or the river or channel, what are the modifications that are occurring? And these sources or pressures then are associated with different types of pathways, and under the ACRES programme they're also associated with some damaging activities. So typical pathways will be things like overland flows or free-flowing drains, and then obviously our streams and rivers. While our damaging activities, these tend to be activities that have the potential either currently or in the future to reduce the ability of the farm essentially to support diversity in plants, and also to give those co-benefits such as water quality. And examples of damaging activities include damage around supplementary feeding, removal of scrub and trees and removal of hedgerows, heavy poaching in terms of the extent of bare soil and erosion, inappropriate use of herbicides, and then other associated activities such as quarrying, burning or dumping. And when we then look at the source or the pressure and the potential pathways that are associated with those sources or pressures, we have to decide what the level of risk to the natural water body is. So estimating the level of risk to water quality of a natural water body is happening within, adjacent to and downstream of the farm essentially, and even more so of the field that you are assessing. And you're not only looking at risk posed to the water quality of the natural water body, you're also to try and determine what the extent and severity of the damage will be to the vegetation and to the habitat associated with that water body. So there are various levels of risk. The first one being no functional pathway, so therefore there is no risk perceived. And then after that, we've got three key levels of risk: low risk, moderate risk, and high risk. Where we have low risk, this is typically where we've got the presence of a minor source, an impeded pathway and a sensitive receptor, but there's no major, impact on the receiving receptor. In relation to some of our damaging activities, Low risk areas or low risk damaging activities would be those that comprise less than 5% of the field. And then as we move towards moderate risk, we see that we've got the presence of maybe a minor source, but a more direct pathway to that sensitive receptor. So there's definitely a higher risk that something potentially is going to happen, and maybe potentially around high rainfall events. When we're associating risk with damaging activities, we're looking at about 6 to 20% of the field being compromised. And then we move to our final risk category, which is a high risk category. And here you're looking at the presence of major sources, a really direct pathway to a sensitive receptor. And there's a very clear threat that water quality is being impacted. From a damaging activities perspective, we're looking at activities here that are comprising greater than 20% of the field. And it's very clear that there's a problem. And this, after we've identified what our damaging activities are in our pathways, and we've assessed our level of risk, ultimately around moderate and high risk situations, then you want to really decide on what your management advice is going to be. And some of the key management advice that's, I suppose, our easy wins are things like keeping high risk activities away from watercourses. And a really good example of that would be not making sure there is no supplementary feeding occurring beside sensitive water bodies. Breaking the connectivity between severely damaged areas and receiving water bodies. Again, fencing is an easy win here, but then building that up to maybe a hedgerow, riparian buffer zone, wetland areas is really valuable. Ensuring a seasonally appropriate stocking levels is key. Ensuring culverts, allowing access for humans, machinery and animals across the water is put in place, and ensuring that there's drinking water supplies, particularly if you're implementing quick management methods such as fencing. So here I want to introduce what are the acre management options, which can be really useful in terms of protecting our water quality. So overall, through the ACRES programme, there are quite a number of management options available to advisors. I have grouped them together to kind of just make it easier to move through and for it not to be too bulky. So looking first at ACRES measures, here many of the options evolve around grassy and woody riparian buffer strips, zones and margins. So this is kind of a key area. You've also got the ideas of planting trees in riparian buffer zones or planting individually groups of trees. Implementation of hedgerows, so again looking at implementing tree planting. And finally then managing intensive grasslands next to watercourses. So these kind of roughly grouped together create 4 categories that you have at your disposal in terms of management measures to kind of be associated with risk and head off any impacts on your water quality. But it's important to look at what the ACRES measures are in terms of the context of what's happening within the wider environmental management arena at the moment. So when we compare what ACRES has included compared to smarter buffers, here many of the same I suppose management measures are coming out. Here we also have grassy and woody riparian buffer zones, wildflower buffers, you've got wetlands, raised buffers, integrated buffers and magic margins, which are all just a variety of riparian buffer zones essentially, but not specifically specified under ACRES. These then again in comparison to the Water EIP, which will be a department funded programme with LawPro and ISUP. Here again we see that grassland, high diversity and mixed riparian buffer zones are going to be a priority along with hedgerows. So this very much aligns with what the ACRES measures are including. They have also gone for wetlands, raised buffers and integrated buffers. And when we compare what's happening then in the wider freshwater arena, especially something, the project like Waters of Life, which is looking at specifically high status objective water bodies, we see that they have selected fixed width buffers, targeted variable width and standard width buffers. They've also gone with hedgerows, wetlands and farm ponds, raised buffers and magic margins. So these are 4 different programs that are occurring at the one time over the next 4 to 7 years, and are all roughly aligned. I have highlighted the similarities in blue, so everything in blue is the same in terms of a grassy or woody riparian buffer zone, and you can see in yellow I've highlighted hedgerows where they appear. The ones in black, which are wetlands, so they're happening across smarter buffers, the water EIP and waters of life, I've highlighted in black because they're essential components within our catchments, but they haven't been specified in the acres measures per se in terms of creating wetlands or creating farm ponds. I would now like to take you through some of the acres management measures, which I'm sure most of you know inside out and have gone through the guidelines, but I suppose I'm framing them from the perspective of protecting water quality, particularly because they're important for our high status objective and priority area for action water bodies. So I'm starting with grassy riparian buffer zones, margins and strips. So I have put the guidelines together for these 3 areas, and while they are separate from an acres perspective in the guidelines, I'm grouping them together today. So this action can apply to a number of different scenarios. You're looking at protecting the water course, interception of high risk PIP-P, delivery flow paths in particular, protection of water quality from nutrient loads, intercepting nutrients and sediment runoff, and overall it's a general useful method for slowing overland flows. So what are the requirements from an acres perspective? Here, if you have arable lands, you're looking at introducing these zones, margins or strips between 3 and 8 metres in width and for 10 to up to 2,500 metres in length. And if you're on grassland, the width is generally 1.5 to 6 metres in width and between 10 and again 2,500 metres in length. And these are the minimum maximum requirements, and then additionally farmers can be within these ranges. You'll notice that on arable land I have 8 metres highlighted in red, and on grassland I have 1.5 metres highlighted in red. And this is because these measurements would be really below what would be expected from protection of a water body. Usually we look for larger buffer strips because they're more effective, and we typically recommend at least 3 metres from rivers and 2 metres from streams. But within cropland, you would expect to be about 10 metres back. So here for the requirements on arable, it's 3 to 8 metres, and we would, where possible, be looking for 10 metres on that buffer width if the farmer could afford the space, essentially. While on grassland, that 1.5 is very low. You'd be definitely looking on small streams for 2 metres, but really looking at 3 from a river perspective. So again, if the space is available and the farmer is willing, definitely be looking for these numbers to increase. Within these grassy riparian buffer zones, margins and strips, there are also additional considerations I would like you to take into account. Some are listed in the acres guidelines, but others are not. So additional considerations will be things like slope, which hasn't been covered. Here you would consider wider buffer zones on steeper slopes, looking at really using a minimum of 10 metres for any sort of slope essentially. So again, where your farm and your farmer is willing to be able to give that space, particularly on steep sloping buffers, then make them wider. Aspect is important. We are really always looking here, in particular on our grassy riparian zones, to have south-facing buffers because this will increase the floristic diversity that you will get, particularly when you're looking to target some of your indicator species and get higher scores. If you are using seed to plant these areas initially in the first year, the guidelines is clear here. You can use 3 species composition. You have to have 40% cocksfoot and then a mixture of timothy, festucas, meadowgrass and red clover. And again here, it's mandated for 40% cocksfoot, and I will be definitely looking to try and get meadowgrass involved because that's an indicator species later on. Ensuring plants are of Irish origin and provenance, but this is covered in the guidelines and you've been provided with lists of suppliers. So this is kind of, I suppose, covered. Here, if you're implementing these buffer zones, margins and strips, you're looking for an implementation in springtime, anytime around February or April, and no later than kind of, I suppose, August time essentially. So looking to get it in over spring, summer, depending on the buffer you're putting in. There are a couple of things to consider. I would look at different types of threats that might impact on the area or the strip prior to you putting it in. Consider where fertilizer runoff might be coming from and where you might be able to make the buffer width wider to account for this. Look at pesticide spray, particularly from arable perspective, so it might be useful to have some like tall trees involved. What are the grazing livestock that may be using the buffer, and looking also at invasive species that are present in nearby areas and are likely to come in if the area is left to its own devices. And when you're preparing the area, ultimately on the other side, you want this to increase your score so that you get a higher payment. So targeting positive grassland indicator species would be very useful. And I've gone through the grassland indicator species and specifically picked out ones that are marshy or of wet grassland origin, because this is really what you're going to be getting in your buffer zone. If you create a grassy strip, buffer or margin, it's going to be of wet grassland variety. So looking at things like meadowsweet, forget-me-nots, lady schmock or cuckoo flower, lesser spearworth, marsh clintfoil, marsh marigold, marsh pennyworth, mint, purple loosestrife, sorrel, tormental, common valerian, yellow flag iris if the soil is quite heavy, bed straws and stitchworts, and then sedges. And these would all be then important in terms of increasing your positive indicator species from a grassland perspective. The second management measure I'd like to talk about is wooded riparian buffer zones, margins and strips. And again, they feature heavily throughout the Acres programme. Here, these actions apply to, again, watercourse protection, interception of high-risk HIP P delivery flow paths, protection of water quality from nutrient loads, intercepting nutrients and sediment runoff, and generally slowing overland flows. But they also provide improved bank stability and provide dapple shade, which are very important in terms of in-stream water quality health. In terms of the requirements, again, we're looking at planting trees within the riparian buffer zone. This can be an individual option if you like. I've put them together here with wooded riparian buffer zones, margins and strips. If you are thinking of considering recommending planting trees within the riparian buffer zone strip, you're looking at 10 to 200 trees. Usually 60 centimetres in height is the required height, and looking at 2 species, so that kind of mixture. So again, if you're putting in 10 trees, 5 of each species, and they should meet the minimum requirement of 60 centimetres. In terms of buffer strips then, again on arable land, we're looking at between 3 and 8 metres in width and a minimum of 10 metres in length. And this is very similar if we're looking at it on grassland. Again, the requirements here are 1.5 to 6 metres in width and a minimum of 10 metres in length. And similar to our grassy riparian buffer zones, margins and strips, I've highlighted the 8 metres on arable and the 1.5 metres on grassland, because from a water quality perspective, we would see that these are insufficient figures. We would certainly be looking for up to 10 metres on arable land in terms of a buffer width. As a minimum really, and then we'd also be looking for a minimum of at least 2 if not 3 metres on grassland, 2 metres for streams and 3 metres for rivers. So again, where your farm and your farmer is open to the idea of having a wider buffer zone, then try it and go for it. In terms of riparian buffer zones, these are classified for arable and grassland in a similar manner and are looking at area as opposed to a width and a length. So here the minimum area is 0.04 hectares up to 2 hectares. In terms of planting trees themselves then, or putting trees within these buffer strips, margins or zones, you can use single trees or small groups of trees, which is likely more preferable where you have groups of 5 to 10 trees together, and this is what the image on the right shows. And usually what you're looking to do is achieve around 20% coverage. Trees should be between 2 and 2.5 metres apart, a minimum being the 2 metres apart. And this, I suppose, depends on the tree species that you're going to put in. Some trees will need to be 2.5 metres apart, say like oaks, whereas things like birches and alders and willows, 2 metres is fine. Consider then that groupings of trees are 10 metres apart. So again, the image on the right gives you an idea of how you could have these small groupings of trees, 5 to 10 trees in a grouping. They're 2 metres apart themselves, and then there's up to 10 metres within the groups. And the planting method that's recommended is pit planting. And this again is very non-invasive in terms of destruction to the riparian buffer zone or the strip of land that you actually want to plant, which is useful, particularly if you're beside high status objective water bodies. It's very easy to, get a spade, get a slice in the land and then slip in the bare root trees. I suppose similar to the grassy riparian buffer zones, margins and strips, as with wooded sections, there are additional considerations that are worth noting. Again, some included in the acres guidelines and others not. So it's just to give that kind of more broader perspective of what might be needed. Again, looking at slopes, wider buffers should be on steeper slopes. And this is, again, if the farmer can afford that space, definitely try to get them bigger. Aspect here isn't as critical. Here you normally plant actually on north side of the watercourse. And again, you're looking at putting in different types of tree species. So it won't be as critical to that south side facing slopes. Species composition then, they should all be native in terms of native tree species, with alder, birch, oak, willow and Scots pine being kind of the dominant ones that are being suggested. And these also are highlighted here in black because they're also key indicator species of woodlands. So again, by putting these species in, you're getting a better quality score straight away. Again, plants should be of Irish origin and provenance. Here we're really looking for trees to go in early spring and certainly no later than the end of March. So the earlier these trees can get in and get established, then they have a whole growing season to kind of take hold. Again, consider threats to the area, particularly if it's going to be a new zone that's going to be kind of planted up. Think about things like fertilizer and what tree species might be best for taking that up. Think about pesticide sprays, again, if it's very much beside arable lands and the ability to have those kind of taller trees that can catch that air spray. Here, there's to be no livestock grazing within these wooded riparian buffer zone strips and margins, which is a little bit different to our grassy areas. But again, consider what livestock may get into the zone. It may not be grazing livestock from your farm and it could end up being deer. So again, it's important to just consider what animals might have access. And again, taking into account invasive species that are within the area, and once you put these trees and you leave them alone, what species might come in and interrupt that natural balance. These areas should be fenced, so it will be important to provide a drinking water source for livestock, particularly if they're new areas and animals have had access to the river watercourse for drinking up to this point. The first thing really before the buffer zone is implemented in terms of planting will be to make sure that those livestock have drinking water source. And again, then when you're considering what kind of species you want to put in or what you're hoping for, will be consider targeting positive woodland indicator species. Here, bramble, elder, guelder rose, spendle, holly, bluebells, wood sorrel, primrose, sedges, and ferns and mosses are the kinds of plants that you're looking to target. Bramble will come naturally, but it may take longer to get some of the other species. So in those species composition mixes, it can be useful to, depending on your soil type, introduce the various trees of elder, guelder rose, spendle, and holly. And then with time, the herbs come. The next management option I would like to consider are hedgerows. And again, this action can apply to a number of different scenarios related to protecting watercourses, such as management of grasslands next to watercourses, protecting water quality itself, reducing soil erosion and sediment runoff, and again, reducing those overland flows. So what are some of the requirements when considering hedgerows as opposed to putting in a wooded riparian buffer zone, strip or margin? So here the requirements are that you've got a minimum of 10 metres all the way up to 400 metres in length of hedgerow, and that's to be of continuous hedgerow. So 10 being the minimum. And if it's a brand new hedgerow, then the minimum unit is 10 metres all the way up to 750 metres in length. Most hedgerows are looking for a mixture of 3 woody species. These are to contain typically 5 plants per metre, and the hedgerow height should be around 1.8 metres. So this is what you're looking to achieve essentially. What you're looking for also are wide bases, and some trees then should be left along the hedgerow to mature up to a maximum of 50 metres. And where cutting or maintaining the hedgerow, you're looking to achieve an A effect. So therefore you've got this wide base at the bottom coming up to this kind of an A-shaped frame, if you like. As with the other two management options, there are additional considerations to take into account, some again which have been listed in the acres guidelines and others not. So additional considerations again would be related to slope, again wider buffers on steeper slopes, and if you can kind of have a wider hedgerow, then that would be great. Aspect here should be south facing, so similar to our grassy buffer zones, strips, margins and zones. Species composition then can vary. You'd be looking here for a broader selection of plants, if you like, compared to your wooded buffer zones. So here, oaks, hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, holly, spendle, guelder rose, alder, rowan, and willows, and even cherry species. And those in black are also your indicator species of woodland plants. So a composition, a mixture of 3 of these as a minimum. And then the more that you can get in, obviously, the better. Again, plants are to be of Irish origin and provenance, similar to our riparian buffer zones. All of these plants, particularly if they're new, should be going in early spring, so before the end of March. And again, to consider some of the threats that might occur. So additional threats that are highlighted for hedgerows would be things like over trimming. It's very easy to get kind of stuck into having everything very neat and tidy. But then the opposite to that is where you just neglect them and don't manage them, and they become a bit unwieldy. Close ploughing, particularly if we're looking at arable. There may be diseases as well, so this will be important, particularly if you have an existing hedgerow and you're looking to, I suppose, improve it. Things like ash trees may need to be removed. Removal of the hedgerow in the first place, and then the usual threats of fertilisers, pesticides and grazing livestock. Again, try to target woodland indicator species when considering the composition of the hedgerow that you want to put in, because again, this is increasing your, I suppose, your scorecard values. So additional species that can also be used would be birch, elder, bramble, and then bracken, bluebells, primroses, sedges, ferns and mosses. These are all the herbs that will come with time. I suppose just a note on the types of trees. It's important to know the soil type in terms of putting some of these species in. Whitethorn and holly are not very useful on wet soils, and whitethorn is not very useful at high elevations either. while blackthorn is more suitable to those heavy waterlogged soils. So these are just some of the considerations to take into account in terms of the preferences of these tree species and their ability to take quickly and get you, I suppose, get the hedgerow up and running within the first year. The final habitat or mitigation measure I want to have a look at are wetlands. They're not specifically named through the Acres programme, but what you'll find is that they're probably throughout the farm that you're assessing and within the catchment. So it's important that at least they're just maintained. In terms of their importance, wetland areas offer a number of advantages. They increase flood protection, both for the farm, but then also for communities downstream. They protect the water course itself and provide good water quality. And they protect the water quality then from nutrient loads, intercepting nutrients and sediment runoff. And again, are very good and really superb at really slowing overland flows and acting as natural filtrations. So consideration, if they're available on the farm, should be given to natural floodplains of a watercourse, particularly if it's very typical that every year an area of land would flood naturally. Then it's considering these areas and stating them as natural wetland areas or natural floodplains. They can also contain remnant woody riparian buffers, wet grassland habitats, marshes and wetland areas. So sometimes these might already be existing on the farm, but with a little bit of help could become very nice habitats and certainly go forward to increasing your positive indicator species list for both wet grassland and for woody or woodland areas. And outside of natural floodplains, you may or may not have then or can implement new small wetland areas or farm ponds. And so considerations in terms of putting in these types of wetlands, the first thing would be to consider fencing it off, and that would be nearly sufficient enough, and making sure that livestock cannot access the area. If possible, rewetting existing wetlands, particularly those on peat or clay soils, or if obviously they're close to peatlands themselves. Restoring reclaimed wetland areas, particularly if areas have previously been cleared, then blocking those drainage channels up or allowing plants to grow in them and kind of block naturally. Ultimately, what you're looking to achieve is that you allow wetland plants to colonise the area naturally, and then you're letting them do their job of taking up the nutrients and creating an equilibrium. If the area floods naturally in winter, then to allow that to happen as opposed to, I suppose, investing in trying to drain it and have improved grassland on it. You can also implement some of the acres measures here within these areas by planting native riparian trees. And these areas can also be managed under kind of scrub or even for bulrush. You can cut or trim small sections of them on rotation over every 2 to 3 years. And this is typically done in late autumn or early winter. Particularly in relation to bulrush, it is best to remove this vegetation type at the end of autumn, because this will have stored up all of the nutrients from the land in the summertime, and if you cut it before it releases back into the environment, then it can be a nice way of removing it. And ultimately what you're trying to do is minimize disturbance to these areas and I suppose let them function in a natural way. So many farms or simply fields on farms will have these wetland systems already in place, and it's just a matter of recognizing them and then I suppose getting added value from them. You may not have to do a huge amount to increase your grassland scores, and simply fencing them might be enough. Placing the right measure in the right place, though, is not an easy process. It seems like it might be straightforward, but there are quite a lot of considerations at play. During your desk study and the field assessment preparations, you're asked to consult the EPA Pollution Impact Potential, or PIP maps. And these are very useful. They come as 4 layers on the EPA mapping system. You've got PIP phosphorus critical source areas, which really look at diffuse sources of pollution within agricultural areas and also on lands that are susceptible to losses, and therefore are useful in terms of identifying high-risk phosphorus release zones. We have a similar system then for our PIP nitrate critical source areas, again looking at sources of nitrate within the environment from agricultural catchments and lands that are susceptible to nitrogen loss. And then there are 2 further layers looking at PIP phosphorus flow delivery paths and flow delivery points. And again, these can be really useful in terms of identifying cattle access points or exact locations at a field level where that phosphorus might be entering your receptor, or which in this case can be your river or lake. So PIP, phosphorus and nitrate are ranked between 1 and 7, where a high PIP then is classified as a ranking between 1 and 3. So these areas are the areas really that we're looking to target, particularly if you're unsure of what section of the river to look for. If you have sections of your river along your field boundaries that are ranked 1 to 3, then these would be the areas you would be focused on. And therefore, from an acres guidelines perspective, it's quite simple. You use your EPA mapping layer, you click on the PIPs layer, and then based on whether it's for phosphorus or nitrate, there's a number of options then in terms of measures that you can consider implementing. However, it's not that straightforward sometimes. And additional questions do need to be asked before you can really get that right measure in the right place. I pose an additional 8 questions which I'd like you to consider when selecting a measure to be placed. And these can be done during the desk survey, and the field assessment preparations can be done either before or after a farm walk essentially. And the first is to really, before you go out, know if your water course is classified as a high status objective water course, or know whether it's protected under the EU Water Framework Directive Register of Protected Species. So here, for example, does it have freshwater pearl mussels or crayfish? Is your water course included in a priority area for action under the 3rd cycle of the EU Water Framework Directive? And for the majority of you, there's quite a bit of overlap between these priority area for actions and the Acres Cooperation projects. So many of you will hit yes for this 3rd question. Knowing your current water quality status is important, because if you are assessing risk on land, then has that already translated to what's going on in your water course, or has it not? And these will help determine the levels of risk to that natural water body. If there are Q values available, again, getting those, sometimes they correlate with what the water quality status is, and others times they don't. So this is important to have both if they're available. My 6th question will be to consult the PIP maps then to understand what your critical source areas are, what are the flow delivery paths and points. But it's not just about those areas. It's also important to know what has been identified as a significant agricultural pressure along that water course, and what are the targeted measures for that water course. And these are all additional 8 layers of mapping that come with the EPA map system. So they're very easy to obtain the answers for. They're a quick click of a button, but it really gives you a lot of information, and you're well informed when you go out to the site. And therefore, placing the right measure in the right place in reality will encompass many of the EPA layers to find the answers that are related to the water courses running along the farm or fields that you are assessing, and where you would like to implement the right measure. So answering these 8 questions means that you are fully informed, not just from a pit map perspective, but from all of the water quality and associate agricultural pressures that may be already identified for these river sites. And this will allow you to make better choices as to what measures you can implement. But remember, with the measures, in reality, it's not going to be one individual measure that's ultimately going to make the difference. It's going to be a suite of measures that are implemented at the farm level and adjacent farms that are ultimately going to result in improved water quality. So improving our water quality status for freshwater bodies can easily be achieved through farming for biodiversity. All of the small things that are implemented, even if there's one right measure in the right place, but over time that's accumulative, can result in really large gains. And any measure that can be put in or can be placed in by the farmer will result in an increased biodiversity score, and not just for the plants and animals that are living on the farm, but also for the associated water bodies that flow through it. Finally, it's important to make that link back to our first lecture where we looked at the natural capital and multifunctional ecosystem services approach. Farming is a very important, contributor to the economy. And yes, while maybe only food and fibres is really recognised in terms of the services it's providing, implementation of good quality buffer zones and hedgerows provides multiple benefits. First of all, I suppose from my perspective, from looking at clean water quality, but you're also looking at water regulation, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration and storage, and climate regulation. And again, additional accessory regulatory functions will be improving air quality and pollination availability on the farm. And this leads then to a higher degree of biodiversity and obviously allowing for greater photosynthesis as all of those plants in riparian buffer zones, whether woody or grassy, grow over time. This allows our ecosystem and our catchment, which is what we're really looking to get going, that it's healthy, there's lots of recreational and ecotourism opportunities, and aesthetically looks very, very pleasing. So providing biodiversity on the farm through the implementation of measures to protect water quality have far-reaching co-benefits. Thank you for listening.